The CIC is delighted to partner with the International Development Research Centre in a series of discussions dedicated to the theme of engaging Canadians on the future of international development after COVID-19. We are most grateful for this partnership and look forward to many thought-provoking discussions on this very topic. I'd like to thank Robert Nash and the Winnipeg branch for hosting the first in this series of discussions last week. And we look forward today to another interesting session. The impacts of this pandemic are resoundingly evident in the lack of robust healthcare systems, the lack of clear leadership for multilateral approaches to stop deadly conflicts and to curb the outbreak of its widespread socio-economic and political destructive implications. In light of these consequences, some observers believe that the sudden outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic has unveiled many shortcomings of our own current way of life on this planet. I'd like to thank Robert Malley, Colleen Duggan, Michael Levitt, and Alan Thompson for lending us your time and your expertise. And I'd also like to thank our technicians Samuel and Daniel for their commitment to the work of the CIC, both at the branch and national levels. Our moderator this afternoon is Professor Alan Thompson. He's Associate Professor at Carleton University in the Faculty of Journalism and Communication. On July 1st, he becomes the head of the program. Congratulations, Professor Thompson. And he joined the faculty in 2003 after spending 17 years with the Toronto Star, of which 10 of those were spent on Parliament Hill, as a correspondent for foreign affairs, defense, and immigration matters. In early 2006, he launched the Rwanda Initiative, a 5-year partnership program with Carleton and its counterpart in Rwanda. He's led various training programs for journalists in Rwanda, Kenya, and in East Timor. While on leave from Carleton, he ran most recently for the Liberal Party in the federal election for the riding of Huron-Bruce. So thank you all, and Alan, over to you to introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And I'm sure we're all sort of equal parts eager and maybe in some ways a bit terrified of the post-pandemic world. I hope there is a post-pandemic world. That's something that I am looking forward to. I'm going to introduce our panelists and then just sort of set out the ground rules for the discussion today. Robert Malley is the president and CEO of Crisis Group, based in Washington, D.C. Before joining Crisis Group, he served in the Obama administration as special assistant to the president and White House coordinator for the Middle East, North Africa, and the Gulf region. He also served as special assistant to President Clinton for Arab-Israeli affairs and director for Near East and South Asian affairs at the National Security Council. And in a previous stint with Crisis Group, he was program director for Middle East and North Africa, leading the organization's research, analysis, policy, prescription, and advocacy in and about the region. I understand he's also an amazing tennis player. I don't know how he finds the time. Michael Levitt is the Member of Parliament for the riding of York Centre in Toronto and sits as a member of the Liberal Party of Canada. He was first elected in 2015 and again last year. His biography notes that as a first-generation Canadian, Michael emigrated to Canada from Scotland with his mother at age 13. In Parliament, one of Michael's roles is as chair of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development, a role he has held for about 2 years now. And I just want to underline that while Michael's participation here is informed by his work as committee chair and a member of the government side, he is not here as a representative of the government or a spokesperson for its foreign policy. As they say on Twitter, his views are his own. Colleen Duggan is program leader of the Governance and Justice Program at the International Development Research Centre, IDRC, here in Ottawa. She has recently returned to IDRC after successfully completing a 2-year assignment as the Deputy Director of Management with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in their largest global field operation in Bogota, Colombia. She has 25 years of expertise with international organizations in strategic programming, planning, evaluation, and donor relationship management in the areas of human rights and the rule of law in conflict-afflicted countries. So as you can see, we have a really, really strong panel for us to work through this pretty open-ended discussion of the post-pandemic world, the emerging post-pandemic world. So my role, as I see it, is not as a speaker. I do have a connection, my personal connection, I guess, to COVID is trying to figure out what it's going to mean for the news media. And we will be hosting a panel, a full 2 days like this at Carleton in October, looking at journalism and the pandemic. But I see my role here today is just bringing you the panelists and then helping with the question and answer period. So in a moment, each panelist will have about 5 minutes for some opening remarks to frame the discussion. When I say about 5 minutes, I actually mean precisely 5 minutes. I think when you cross the 4-minute mark, I might just sort of give you a bit of a Zoom high sign, and when your time is up, I'll nod vigorously. So we'll have 3 opening statements, and we might as well go in the same order as the introductions, Rob, Michael, and Colleen. Then we'll have a bit of a discussion among the 4 of us before we open the floor to questions. Now, I'll be keeping an eye on the questions that are being posed, and I suggest to those who are watching or listening, you should have a Q&A function somewhere on your screen. Type your questions into the Q&A function, and we'll keep an eye on them there. And I think at the end of a period of open questions and answers, I think we'll end up having about half an hour for that. I'll wait for a signal perhaps from Elizabeth to bring us to a close. And then I would like to ask each of our panelists just to spend about a minute at the end by way of conclusion, and I'll turn the floor back over to our host, Elizabeth. So at this point, if I could ask Rob Malley to begin with his opening remarks.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks, all of you. I've never been introduced as a tennis player, let alone a great one, so I'll remember this event only for that. I do want to start, if I may, with a few thoughts about our colleague, Michael Kovrig, a Canadian citizen who has been in prison for 561 days now, arbitrarily by China. I think, I'm assuming all of you have followed the news that he's been recently charged. I could get into it more later. You know, just suffice it to say, this is a political case that's masquerading as a judicial one. I hope some of you will have heard his wife spoke out for the first time today in very moving ways, sort of pulling the veil on what it has been like for him. 561 days, obviously not seeing his family, not seeing the fresh air, not seeing a tree. 6 months of that period, he was in solitary. So it is a painful reminder every day that Michael is behind bars, and I know it is for all Canadians and for people around the world who have been expressing their support. So I want to thank all the Canadian government for working for his release, and hopefully even more can be done so that he and Michael Spavor could be reunited with their loved ones soon. It's appropriate, I guess, to talk about China in the context of COVID-19, given how much, if I now want to pivot to that, how many ripple effects this health crisis has had as a health crisis that is also doubling down as an economic crisis, and for many, a political crisis, crisis in conflict areas that Crisis Group covers around the globe. It is sort of almost a unique event in how much it has struck so many countries at the same time in so many different ways, not just the countries that have been hit by the pandemic itself. And we see now, contrary to initial expectations, that it is hurting developed and less developed countries likewise. But the measures that have been taken to control it have also had ripple effects that we're coping with and we will be living with for a long time. My remarks, I want to focus on what I'm considering sort of the battle of narratives, which will determine in many ways how we come out of this crisis. There's 2 broad narratives. One is that this is a worldwide health crisis, which demonstrates the need for a worldwide response and the fallacy of a go-it-alone approach. And that's a view which has logic and science on its side, that countries need to work together, They need to share knowledge. They need to share any remedy, vaccine, or cure that they might find. Then they need to work together to strengthen the WHO, work together to help less developed economies so that they don't suffer too much, and make sure that the epidemic is vanquished everywhere, because if it's not vanquished everywhere, it is vanquished nowhere. So that's the argument that one could hope would come out of this, which is a plea for more multilateralism, for more burden sharing, for more of a collective effort to deal with what is going to be a crisis that's going to live with us. And that if it goes unchecked, will spell disaster in a number of countries, which could lead to migration flows, which could lead to chaos in countries that will leave nobody untouched. Of course, there's another narrative. And if the first one has logic and science on its side, the second one has politics on its side. And in some ways, that may be the stronger headwind. Crises as a general matter don't shift trends, they accelerate them, they deepen them. And in this case, COVID-19 has come at a time when we've already seen so many of these pre-existing negative trends towards a fight against a resistance to globalism, questioning the international order, questioning the notion of international solidarity, more nativism, more xenophobia. In my country, I could say, we've seen it very clearly in the last years. And in that sense, COVID-19, unfortunately, risks accelerating and exacerbating those trends. So against the view of greater global solidarity, we could see a view in which countries say, well, we have one priority and one priority only, which is to take care of our own, because we have the health crisis and the economic crisis. And COVID-19, the virus, rather than being a clarion call for countries to come together, could be viewed and will be painted by some as an argument for building bigger walls. We don't fight it together, we're going to protect ourselves from staying away from each other. And we're seeing already a number of countries, for good reason, don't have the resources, don't believe it's a priority for them to invest in development or in conflict resolution or in diplomacy or in economic assistance to other countries. And so I think we risk seeing, even at a time when the need and the call for multilateralism, for caring about others and for caring about conflict resolution around the globe, that contrary trend, the trend that is very much one of go-it-aloneism, and which I think we had already seen preceding COVID-19, is very much, could be very much on the rise. So the real question, I think, from this standpoint, and I forgot to talk about greater divisions between China and the US, which have been exacerbated by COVID-19. The real question is which of these two narratives will prevail, and whether a stronger, more generous and more burden sharing and collective sense might emerge. We're in the business of being optimists, otherwise we couldn't do our job, but I think we face, as I said, very, very strong headwinds. And it is going to take a lot of effort and a lot of doing by a lot of leaders around the world to fight against what is going to be the natural tendency, which is to retreat to nativist xenophobia and scapegoating of the other. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rob. Michael.
Thank you very much, Alan. Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining today's session, and to the CIC for organizing this timely discussion. By way of introduction, which has already been given, I'm Michael Levitt, and I'm the MP for York Centre in Toronto, and I've served as the chair of the House Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development since 2018, and before that chaired its subcommittee on international human rights. In the 5 years I've been on the committee, we've studied countless issues in Canadian foreign policy, as you would imagine. Things like Canada's Arctic sovereignty, women, peace and security, and threats to liberal democracy in Europe. But I've also noticed that as Canadians, we can sometimes be too circumspect in talking about why we have those policies in the first place. Yes, we support things like maternal and newborn, sorry, the thing's kicking in here, there we go. Yes, we support things like maternal and newborn child health, the protection of LGBTQ rights, girls' education, and for example, Ukrainian sovereignty, because it's the right thing to do. But we also do these things because they are in our interest. Supporting these issues is how we strengthen the liberal, rules-based international order, which is the best means to defend and promote Canadian interests and values in the world and ensure our own peace and prosperity. This has been true from Lester Pearson to today. Canada is neither a superpower nor an island unto ourselves. We are a middle power and a trading nation. We work best and most effectively when we build coalitions, build predictability and order in international affairs, and promote liberal values. I do not believe COVID has changed this. Rather, I think it's brought into stark relief how important this framework is and the risks of retrenchment. We're in a global pandemic, and we have to make sure there's a coordinated global response. No country is unaffected or can face this virus alone. It's essential that we work together to defeat the virus, and I think this is perhaps an essential lesson in the importance of multilateralism to protect our interests. Now, we know the international system is far from perfect. There are plenty of examples to choose from of its shortcomings. The WHO has clear deficiencies that have been laid bare during the pandemic, but that means we should address those shortcomings, not dismiss the organization entirely. During this crisis, many seem to have forgotten the successful role the WHO has played in bringing vaccination rates up worldwide, eradicating diseases, and supporting developing health systems. At the same time, there are serious questions that need answering about the WHO's approach at the beginning of the outbreak, how it handled and represented data and communications, and its powers when it's restricted by the willingness of states to cooperate despite the devastating global impact of these decisions. We have to approach this situation clear-eyed about the limits we face and work as best we can to remedy those shortcomings. Less COVID-related, but just as important, are the serious issues that threaten the international system from within. Things like the undermining and delegitimization of human rights bodies when Iran is elected at the UN Commission on the Status of Women, or when a country like Mauritania, where slavery is still practiced, is elected to the Human Rights Council alongside such luminaries as Venezuela and Eritrea. We've seen crisis in Syria, Myanmar, and Libya get worse as international bodies were frozen from inaction. I don't think we should abandon these organizations to the dictators and dilettantes who actively work to undermine their legitimacy. I think as much as we can now and in the future, we have to work to strengthen the international system under liberal values to protect our interests. But we can't do that alone. It's important that the community of democracies works together to promote and protect human rights. We've seen a dangerous backslide in the past few years of liberal democracy around the world, and it's something we must address. On top of the fortunate position Canada holds as a member of the G7, G20, APEC, OAS, Commonwealth, Francophonie, and NATO, we have to continually work with other countries, leverage those relationships, and always strengthen international norms and organizations. We've seen this multiple times in just the past month, whether it was the WTO reform and combating protectionism, the G7 foreign ministers condemning China's national security law in Hong Kong, the mobilization of international support in condemning the arbitrary arrest and calling for the release of the two Michaels, the Ministerial Coordination Group on COVID-19, or reaffirming Canada's commitment to the global coalition against Daesh. Unfortunately, these issues haven't stopped during COVID. If nothing else, their vulnerabilities have been magnified. Despite the threat of the internet, despite the threats the international rule-based order faces, we have to stand firm in our defense of our values and interests. As it stands, I don't believe the post-COVID world will be altogether different from the pre-COVID world, but I do think it's shown us the risks of inaction and the importance of standing up for the fundamental Canadian values like democracy, freedom, the rule of law, and human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Colleen.
Thanks very much, Alan, and great to hear you both, Michael and Robert. I'm going to just really pick up where I think both of you left off, and that's really just to say that what we're facing right now is just so much more than a health crisis. It runs much deeper than that, and the social, economic, and political impacts are now, we know, being felt very rapidly across the globe and predictably in the global south, with great potential for these to widen existing inequities, deepen poverty, generate insecurity, and increase human rights abuses, as we've heard. And there are overall risks that governance capacities can be and are being undermined. We're seeing that in countries which we understood to be fairly functional democracies, checks and balances are not in place with results, I think, that are worrying. and that we need to get a handle on through whatever tools that we have, multilateralism and the international organizations that we have at our disposal, as imperfect as they might be. So this is the system that we have to work within. I wanted to also bring our lens a little bit to the fact that in order to be able to act, and as the title of this event was around the post-pandemic world, I'd like to think a little bit about some of the things that we need to be thinking about doing to prepare for the longer term socioeconomic impacts and hopefully eventually policies for recovery from COVID. And the first thing that I would say that is in order to be able to do that, and although there are wide-ranging measures now being put in place at varying speeds in different low-income contexts, there is an urgent need for reliable, contextually grounded local data and evidence to inform appropriate responses to the pandemic in the global south. And we also need to start thinking about what policies and plans can be that we can put in place to prepare for different scenarios and models for social, economic, and overall governance recovery. At IDRC, we're working in that direction. Like many organizations, when this all started, we hit the reset button on our budget in order to stream resources as much as possible to researchers and research networks in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, so that they can begin generating ideas and solutions for both response and for recovery. So we've also heard a lot about opportunities potentially to build back better. That is to rebuild and retool economies and political and social systems so that they address ongoing challenges, including things like climate change, opportunities perhaps to become carbon-free, for example, and perhaps opportunities to, again, hit that reset button and build a more just and equitable world. So just really thinking in terms of the words of the UNSG, using this watershed moment to invest in critical public services and global public goods. The challenges are many, but I'd like to take a few moments to offer some reflections on what I see as the justice challenges that we're seeing across the globe, and these will likely continue to grow in the future. And to think about how justice responses might give us a leg up for building back in ways that protect and promote important human rights. In the days ahead, we can expect to see political, social, and cultural dislocation that could exacerbate violence and security, as our other speakers have mentioned, and with impacts in both fragile and conflict-affected countries, as well as in stable countries. Now, amidst this, it's important to remember that justice systems and justice workers are vital to responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially for mitigating its worst effects that we've been hearing about. And yet, access to and delivery of justice is not currently viewed as an essential service. That's understandable in the short term, but that may have to change in the future if we want to maintain peace and stability in many countries. What are some things that we can think about in terms of how justice is being delivered, which can be carried to the future potentially with dividends in the sense that they will allow justice to be delivered to more people, especially the most vulnerable and marginalized? And here I'm talking about people like women, informal sector workers, refugees, internally displaced. All of these people are being disproportionately hit by COVID-19. So quickly, I'd like to mention three things. First, the international community needs to act early to protect justice systems, recognizing that they form part of every country's critical national infrastructure. It's important that we do this now to ensure that justice does not fall permanently off the list of policymakers. The pandemic has already sparked an economic, employment, and financial crisis whose effects are likely to be unknown for at least 5 years. Following an unprecedented shutdown in economic activity, we see that the risks are high around mass unemployment and recession, and it's not clear that emergency measures that have been put in place, states of exception, et cetera, are not going to be held in place for long periods of time by leaders. The costs of protecting lives and caring for millions of ill people are going to be high, and they will lead to greatly increased debt. And the prospect of protracted periods of readjustment. Geopolitical competition and tensions could put additional pressure on the multilateral system, as both of our speakers have mentioned, and impede the necessary interactions, cooperation, and collective norm setting that we need to be doing for cross-border assistance. At a time of flux, we have an imperative to push for fairer and more resilient, sustainable world with a guiding vision to leave no one behind. Second, and quickly, I'd like to say that we need to support and encourage approaches for increasing innovation and smart working in the delivery of justice. One of the things about this pandemic is that it has pushed us towards being more innovative in the way that justice is delivered. And interestingly, we were facing huge justice problems going into this. The Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies estimated that around the world about 1.5 billion people already had criminal, civil, and administrative justice problems that they couldn't resolve. Many of these problems relate to things like accessing property, threat of evictions, indebtedness, securing identity documents, parochial everyday problems, but have huge impacts in terms of damaging people's health and loss of income. So now we're moving to approaches where we're seeing online case delivery, over the phone consultations, instead of the other alternatives that people usually have in terms of going to court. So these are some of the types of things that we need to think about that we can flip and leverage as we move into thinking about how we can increase the delivery of justice for people in the future. It obviously doesn't solve the big weighty problems, but some of these smaller problems have real impacts for people. And then just in closing, I'd like to also note that we need to ensure sustainable international support for the justice response. And that's real follow through in the way that we're thinking about delivering international assistance. The health sector has demonstrated the importance of global cooperation during the crisis as international organizations, global partnerships, the private sector, civil society networks are coming together with the media to rally support for accelerated action. And I think the justice sector can also do much more and much better in this sense. There's a lot of great ideas that are circulating around out there. And so I think opportunities for this type of debate and exchange are just the type of thing we need to be doing right now. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you. So I just want to remind those who are watching or listening, click on the Q&A box if you would like to post a question, and we'll pull them from there and I'll put them to the panelists. You can address it to an individual or to all three. It's however you wish, so please do that. And in the meantime, maybe I'll just throw a question at each one of you in order, and then I'll monitor as questions appear from those who are watching. Rob, I had a question for you. There's a very short version of the question. Trump. That's the short version. I think the longer version is, you know, you set out these two very interesting narratives, right, that are now battling. And is it not just obvious that the US president is the author of one of those narratives? And is that not one of the greatest challenges that we face, that a world power that should be the leader in taking us to the kind of multilateral solutions that we need is not only not very interested, but may well be blocking those? Or is that overestimating the impact of one individual?
So, I mean, it's a good question. I think we should neither overestimate nor underestimate President Trump's impact. I mean, I like to think of him as both a cause and a symptom. I was saying earlier that a lot of the trends that we're seeing accelerated by COVID-19 pre-existed it. Trump was like COVID-19. He accelerated the trends, but he also, they existed before him. He is as much an expression of some of the frustrations, some of the feelings, at least in the US, but you know, you could also make an analogy to Brexit, feeling of people who felt that they had not been taken care of. He may well be the wrong answer to the right questions, but feelings of marginalization, feeling that globalization had led to unequal development, you know, just a feeling of, and also in the case of the US, the feeling that the US had done too much for too many others, Iraq war, Afghanistan war, and there was time to focus back home. So I think he, in some ways, surfed on that and took advantage of those feelings. And then of course, he accelerated them and exacerbated them in ways that are Trump. I mean, that's the word, that was your question, that's the answer. He has a very peculiar way of looking at the world, which we could discuss, but I think it is very much the view when he says America first is that he believes that other countries have been free riders and that the multilateral system, the global system, has acted at the expense of the US, and that for the US should treat all of these as transactional arrangements, and when they help the US should participate, and when it doesn't, it should walk away. And Canada has been, as much as, maybe not as much as any, but has been a victim and a witness to the way he looks at the world. So it is correct to say that if Joe Biden were to be elected in November, you will see a major shift in a major actor in that global system. But to think that that is going to suddenly bring us back to where we were at some point, and I think we also have to be careful about not being overly, put rose-tinted glasses about what the world before this crisis looked like. But I think that would be an illusion, because what brought Trump to power is not going to disappear with him losing power. It predated him and it would outlast him. And I think those are some of the issues of inequality, of the feeling that it really is a system, not just, and I'll end on this, because I think people look at it as a system that has been unequal in its distribution of resources and power and justice domestically, but also internationally. And I think those are twin crises of unequal distribution within nation states and among nation states. And if we don't address that, I think the Trump phenomenon is a phenomenon that will take different shapes and different forms, but it won't go away.
Okay, thanks. Michael, just to sort of riff on that question, you talked about the role Canada could play. Assuming that we're dealing with the political narrative, where some of this is going to fall to us, not just as an actor on the multilateral stage, but as the closest neighbor to the United States, where we are supposed to hold some influence. How do we, in an election year, tackle this narrative led by President Trump without the risk of looking as if we're interfering in an election process? We're literally months, weeks away from a US election.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think carefully and cautiously is the short answer to the question. I think for the last 4 years, I have made, along with my colleagues, let's talk at a parliamentary level. It certainly happens at the government level amongst the Prime Minister, ministers, parliamentary secretaries. But even at a parliamentary level, we have expanded our, as Elizabeth would know from her time with the committee, but we've expanded our reach beyond the executive level, making sure that we are reaching out and working and building alliances with representatives from both the Democrats and the Republicans on issues like, for example, international human rights. In Congress, in the Senate, there is a huge pool of legislators in the States from both parties that want to be active and involved. And we've made every possible attempt. We've been down to Washington a number of times, both with the Foreign Affairs Committee and with the Human Rights Subcommittee, making sure that we're building those relationships. So I think in part the answer to your question is we have to be careful. We have to be strategic, understanding Canada's needs and the position that Canada's in, but we also have to look at the broader picture as it relates in Washington, D.C., because there are lots of allies and lots of people, in both parties who understand the importance of having a United States active and engaged in the international system, who know the importance of having their voice speak out on human rights. You've got the Lantos Commission, you've got lots and lots of activity that goes on. Of course, a lot of it gets drowned out by the executive level. Certainly for me as a parliamentarian, it's about reaching out and really building and strengthening those relationships, because those relationships, to Robert's earlier point, those relationships stand the test of any one election. Whether the Democrats come back or whether it's the Republicans, whether it's Trump, whether it's Biden, those relationships, many of them will stand because many of those individuals will be in there after, as they were when I got first elected and they were there under Obama.
Good. Thanks, Michael. And we'll come back to you. And I know you have to leave at 4 because of another event. So we'll keep that in mind. Just to remind people, do post questions to the Q&A board. And while I wait for a couple more to land there, I just want to put one quickly to Colleen. You describe a really ambitious agenda for how to take advantage of the opportunities that we're going to be presented with post-COVID. And yet, right now, we see trillions of dollars being poured into support, assistance, COVID emergency relief efforts. Is it not also a pretty realistic expectation that post-COVID, at a time when there'll be this great opportunity to work in the development field, ODA will almost certainly be one of the first budget lines to be slashed? How are we going to tackle this with less money to deal with this great opportunity to make a difference?
Yeah, it's a great question, Alan. And I think it's a larger question that, I mean, I would say even pre-COVID, you know, ODA has been dropping in most countries for quite a while. So we've really been struggling with this issue of how we are financing development cooperation. And I mean, now we're really talking about so much more than development cooperation. We're talking about an international financial system, which in some ways is going to be profoundly affected. So, I mean, my sense is that this is going to profoundly affect the way that we even interact in multilateralism and how we interact with governments all over the world. You know, those of us who work in international development have been talking for years about innovative financing and new financing tools and how we work with the private sector and impact bonds and all of these types of things. So that conversation has started. I would say it certainly doesn't go as far as it needs to, but I mean, that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin, which is always the elephant in the room, and what leaders never want to talk about, but there really does have to be serious conversations, and there are conversations going on around debt relief and debt forgiveness. It's going to be absolutely impossible to pay back the levels of debt that are mounting up now under current systems in our lifetime or in our children's lifetimes. So that is going to require some pretty deep and mature diplomacy across all countries and across all systems. So it's a little bit of a cop-out answer, but I don't think that ODA and financing international humanitarian or whatever, the way that we have been setting it out and delivering is, I think we're going to be in a fundamentally new scenario. And we've been talking a lot for a long time around how international multilateralism and international development is falling short of the mark, and needs are really outstripping resources. So now is the time to be facing up to that, I think.
Thanks, Colleen. I'm going to start taking questions from the board here, and this one is addressed to all panelists from Ferry to Kirchhoff. How do you assess the impact of the United States on the recovery? Feel free to jump in. Michael. Oh, I think your mic is muted there, Michael.
I mean, I think the answer to that has to be significantly. It's going to have a significant impact on how well we fare in Canada, both from a public health perspective. You know, the border's closed now, but can it be closed indefinitely? Certainly, it's been longer than a lot of people thought it would be, and it's not showing any signs of opening soon, especially as we're seeing spiking rates in the States. But also economically, there's got a huge impact on the Canadian entrepreneurs. We're entering into the new NAFTA kicking in, obviously. So yeah, no, I think it's a very, very significant issue, and one which I know that they're going to be looking at closely in Ottawa.
Okay, Rob or Colleen?
I mean, that's the fundamental question. I think, yeah, definitely the U.S. is going to carry a huge impact on what the recovery is going to look like. And my panelists may not agree, but I also feel like, you know, thinking back to Rob's introductory remarks, you know, the world is changing fundamentally. The balance of power is changing fundamentally. Asia does not look like it did 30 years ago. Where resources lie, how capital is flowing north, south, and east, west, all of that is changing. And I mean, I think over the years, I would say in many ways, the leverage of the United States has been eroding on many fronts. And so I don't think we should be surprised if we see new actors step forward into this vacuum to start playing new roles. And we have to be ready for that.
Okay. I'm going to combine a couple because they touch on a similar theme. One question was, how would the panelists assess the inaction by the Security Council vis-a-vis the pandemic? And another question, a little more pointed, coming from the ivory tower and pontificating about empty liberal values caused sufficient damage to our reputation internationally that we lost Canada's bid to join the Security Council. Is there a new path forward? So I'll throw that open to all the panelists. Role of Security Council and whether or not Canada lost a chance to actually have a bit more leverage there.
I'm happy to answer the Security Council. I don't want to speak about Canada's loss. I mean, it was very tough competition. I do think Canada ran a good campaign, but I will say just a few words about the Security Council because this is something that, particularly on the issue that the Secretary General threw out, which is can we get a global COVID-19 ceasefire, which, you know, obviously our organization endorsed because for so many reasons. Obviously, a ceasefire is always a good thing, but in particular at a time when you need health workers to be able to have access to zones of conflict where displaced peoples, refugee camps, all of the most vulnerable populations that Colleen was talking about, they're the ones who are most at risk. And if conflict continues, it makes the risk of contagion even greater and the ability to take care of vulnerable populations much harder. At first, I think there was a sense that maybe this call is having more echo than was expected. A number of armed groups and states involved in conflict from Colombia to Cameroon to the Philippines to Yemen seem to be reacting, you know, on paper at least positively. And then two things happened. One, which is I think the main reason, is that these were nice words, but the conflict dynamics prevailed. And when entities felt that they should continue the conflict, they weren't going to stop at pandemic or no pandemic. The other point, which is that outside powers did not put pressure on these armed groups or states to stop fighting. And this is where the inaction of the Security Council is at least illustrative of the fact that this was not viewed as a priority. Now, the Security Council is only a reflection of the state of great power relations. I mean, so it's not as if at other times when you had great tension between the Soviet Union or the United States or China, the United States, that the Security Council was able to do much on its own. But it was particularly telling that something that seemed as innocuous and as self-evident to call for global ceasefire at a time of an international emergency, that the Security Council, and particularly the United States and China, got mired in this dispute about what you'd call the virus and whether you would praise or not or mention the WHO. I think it really doesn't reflect well on either one. I certainly expected more from the United States, and I don't think it covered itself in glory. Again, a Security Council resolution would not have transformed the conflict landscape. But the fact that they were not even able to muster that form of determination, I think, spoke volumes about the priority that those countries at least were giving to the need to silence the guns at a time when the death was raging for other reasons and where you needed healthcare workers to have access to the most vulnerable populations.
So, Michael, if I can just reframe the Security Council question a little bit. Sure. I mean, you're talking about advocating for the role that Canada needs to play on the world stage, bringing about multilateral solutions. But we kind of vilify the Trump narrative, the political narrative that Rob described, and yet it's very compelling for a lot of people. There are a lot of people who support that view, who now might well agree in Canada, this is time to build walls. Let's take care of ourselves. We tried to get this Security Council seat and it didn't work. How do you counter that?
Yeah, so as a starting point, I don't think there's anything empty about liberal values like freedom, democracy, rule of law, and human rights. And I think the setback at the UN Security Council is not reflective of any notion that Canada should stop playing an even greater role in this post-pandemic world that we're talking about in building relationships. In terms of relating it back to the question on the generally the Security Council's inability to kind of act, I think what we're seeing is the importance of like-minded allies and friends working together. We've seen, for example, the foreign ministers kind of coalition that François-Philippe Champagne has put together on COVID, meeting every couple of weeks to be able to address issues as they arise. We saw, for example, on pushback against China and the national security law, Canada and the US, the UK, and Australia speaking out strongly against what's happening in Hong Kong. These are important opportunities in the absence often of leadership at the Security Council, because hands are often tied there. This is an opportunity for Canada and like-minded allies to work together. They're going to have, we have to do that. We need to do that, given what's happening out there. And even at a parliamentary level, I joined together with the Foreign Affairs Committee chairs from Australia, New Zealand, and the UK just a couple of weeks ago on the same Hong Kong issue with a call for a special envoy from the UN to be appointed to Hong Kong. I think these informal or new multilateral coalescing of allies are going to be even more important. And I think Canada can continue to have a leading role there as a middle power.
Michael, I know you have to go in a couple of minutes, so I wonder if I could put one more question to you. Do you think that Canada should mount its own commission of inquiry into the COVID pandemic and how our institutions have fared, both within the country and in the way we have interacted with others? Is it worth making that kind of introspection part of our global effort to try and bring about some learning in the post-pandemic world?
Listen, I think it's clear that reflection on what's gone on over the last 4 or 5 months is going to be something that's going to be very important from multiple perspectives. It'll be important from the public health perspective. It'll be important from an economic recovery perspective. I think it's going to be important across the board. In terms of how that actually happens and what the means to making that happen is, I don't know what that will be, but I think these are certainly questions that are absolutely active and valid. And that's the way, as I said in my opening remarks, and as I think Robert had mentioned in relation to the WHO, we're going to need to have a really meaningful analysis. And again, this relates back to our working with other like-mindeds out there. Over the course of the last 2.5 months, I've spoken to numerous of the ambassadors to Canada, and the feeling that that once we sort of get through this first phase, we start working together to address whether it's the WHO or whether it's the domestic response. I think these are important and valid questions for sure.
Okay, Michael, before you have to go, I just wanted to ask all 3 panelists, does anyone have a question for someone else based on what you heard so far? And then otherwise I can go back to questions that are being posed from the audience. Anything you want to ask each other?
No, but okay, I just want to make a comment to Robert. Yes. And it's on the 2 Michaels, which I know obviously he has a very particular and personal interest in as it relates especially to Michael Kovrig. And I just want to say to you that from a parliamentary level, this is something that has been and will continue to be of the utmost importance and very personal. I mean, the fact that these two men continue to be held, continue to be facing the conditions they're facing. I thought Vina's narrative and the article that came out yesterday really brought home for Canadians who may not have been as aware what that family is going through. Vina is so strong, but also what the Michaels are going through in their captivity. This is a wake-up. This is a wake-up call, and again, ever more important that this particular issue is internationalized. In the last week alone, we've seen Foreign Minister Rob in the UK and Secretary Pompeo come out really strongly in raising this issue. We need so much more of that. We need it at a governmental level, at an executive level. We also need it from parliamentarians, and I know it's something that not just in Canada, but around the world, we care a lot about.
I really appreciate that, and I think that the message has to be, I mean, just to foot stomp that point. I mean, it's not just China. Of course, we're affected by China, but around the world, we're seeing countries that are playing with the lives of individuals for these purposes, and the less they feel that there are consequences, the less they feel like there's a rule that should apply to them, the more they'll do this. And again, it's happened for a long time. It's happening now with greater intensity when people feel like no rules apply anymore. And I think, so I take that message to heart, and thanks. I know how much Vina appreciates your support.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Michael. So I'll take a question here from the board from Robert Turnbull. Most would agree that the international rules-based world order has been under threat, especially under the Trump administration. If the Democrat nominee is elected president in November, can we look for a renewed commitment by like-minded countries to reform the order after it survived a near-death experience during the Trump era? I sense a theme developing here, but this is the question from the floor. So I would invite any of you to jump in.
Michael, if you have something to say, because I know you have to leave, but otherwise.
No, I'm good to listen at this point.
Colleen,
you were about to say something.
Sure. No, I mean, I definitely, of course, I'm not sitting in the United States as Robert is, but I mean, I definitely think that we can expect changes. I also think that we can't be naive. The deadlockedness of the Security Council and the particular dynamic of the Security Council is historic, and it's something that's been building really over decades. I mean, even when we just think about, I mean, I think back, how long it really took to get down to some solutions on the conflict in the Balkans. The Security Council really ran around the block a number of times before they got to the level of resolutions that were needed to start things moving there. So, I mean, the Security Council is, by virtue of its birth and its childhood, has been encountering problems for quite a while. So, I mean, I think, in the current context, Security Council reform, I think, is still going to be very much on people's minds, but many administrations have tried and many administrations have failed. But my own sense is that with changes in Washington, I mean, things won't happen overnight, but change often, it does start with narrative, and narrative is important in international diplomacy for getting things done. It doesn't carry the day, but it does open doors in terms of people are much more open to start engaging in constructive dialogue. So, even just changing the narrative around certain things is a really important first step.
If I could add, I mean, I don't think one could underestimate the importance of this election. I'm obviously partisan in this, or at least I have a view, but regardless of what one thinks of Vice President Biden, the cavalier way and as I said, the transactional and valueless way in which President Trump has dealt with allies and foes, North Korea, Iran, the way he's dealt with non-proliferation, with climate change, and the like. I mean, that is, as I said, there's something very specific about President Trump, and it is really, I think, made it virtually impossible for the like-minded countries to speak in one voice, or to have the credibility to speak in one voice when one of its members is acting the way the US has. So I think that is a fact. So some things will change. We know that President Biden believes in multilateralism, believes in traditional alliances, whether it's with Canada, with the EU, with other countries. I think he would believe in respecting some of the commitments that the US has made in the past, whether it's the Iran nuclear deal or the Paris climate change accord. Some things won't change. I said that before, and I think others have said it on this in this session. There is a feeling in the US, which is strong and which goes back, frankly, to President Obama's election. I mean, he ran on the notion that the US had overcommitted itself militarily around the world. 8 years later, when you have the two of the candidates who sort of galvanized public opinion, then candidate Trump and Senator Sanders, both ran on the notion that the US had to, for very different reasons and with very different worldviews, but the notion that the US had to care more about, had to be less involved in external adventures, military adventures for the most part. And we saw the same in this Democratic primary, where one candidate after another said, enough with these endless wars. So I think there is this impatience, this feeling that the US has tried too much to be the world's policeman, and I would agree with that. So that is not something that's going to change, and sometimes it goes beyond it, and it's a feeling that the US needs to care less about the outside and more about itself. And I think that will be all the more the case for the reasons I gave at the outset, which is that the US is facing a health crisis, an economic crisis, and now a racial justice crisis. And there's going to be a demand for US resources and attention to be devoted to curing those three before taking care of the rest of the world. So you're not going to see the US come back, I think, as some may hope or fear, and play the same role it did in the past. So there will be a change. In some ways, it may be sort of a better outcome where the US decides it has to work more with like-minded countries, share the burden more, share responsibility more, act with greater humility at a time when, yes, it faces great external challenges, but domestically, it has a lot of repair work to do.
Okay, thanks, Rob. And Michael, I know you had to go. So
I'm gonna go now. I just wanted to take the opportunity. I just want to take the opportunity to say thank you again for including me in this panel, and to Colleen, to Robert, Alan, Elizabeth, to everybody involved in setting it up. Thank you for having me on, and enjoy your last 10 minutes.
I know you'll be sad to miss a lot more Security Council questions that are lining up. But,
you read my mind. Okay, bye guys. Thank you.
I just want to go back to the question board here. There was a question, actually, all joking aside, about the Security Council. In this case, Deborah Parks essentially said, why worry so much about this failed effort? There were 3 good candidates, 2 seats. Can't we change the discourse, move forward, something that's more helpful, put our energies into something else? The very next question in the queue, again from Ferry to Kirkov, could the pandemic provide us with an essential opportunity for a major overhaul of the multilateral system? And maybe if I could put that to both Rob and Colleen, what sort of opportunity is there for an overhaul of the multilateral system? Rob?
First, on the first point, I tried to say the same thing. I'm sorry, you'll hear the phone ring, but somebody will answer.
Okay.
I tried to say the same thing. There's 3 very strong candidates, and so I wouldn't read this as my own view of repudiation of Canadian values, and I wouldn't overread it. Somebody had to lose of the 3. I think the second question really goes to what I was saying earlier. It could be a revival of the multilateral system in which, and in some ways for the better, because the era of what a French foreign minister called the hyperpower, US hyperpower, was not all that great for many people around the world. It may not have been all that great for the US for the reasons I just gave. And so the notion of a more balanced world order in which countries that have been on the receiving end of, whether it was a receiving end of superpower battles, may have a bigger voice and may be able to weigh more on affairs that are going to affect them. I think one could imagine that world, a new order in which the US is balanced by other countries, and where the developing world has a more forceful voice than it's had in the past. But that's not a given, as I said. So one could imagine that. One could also be very realistic and say there's another world out there, a more chaotic one, in which you see great power competition that is exacerbated and mid-power competition because of the vacuum at the top. So I think it's very much like so much of what we're discussing today, how long the pandemic is going to last, what its impact is going to be, what impact economically it's going to have. the question about what the geopolitical impact and the impact on the multilateral system is not a given, because it will depend on the choices that men and women around the world are going to make, who they vote for, and how they mobilize when the people come to power, and how the people who are in power are going to act.
Colleen?
Yeah, I also share Rob's read on that. I think it can go either way. I like to be, I'm an optimist. I try to be an optimist. And so, you know, I would like to think that this great crisis is maybe going to galvanize the international community to think that they need to be working together to solve this problem. I mean, just the very fact of even trying to find a vaccine and bring it to commercialization and distribution fast enough is, you know, by definition going to require international cooperation. There's no way around that. Otherwise, we're just going to have silos of countries who are vaccinated and others who aren't vaccinated, and international trade simply can't work on that basis. So some level of international cooperation has to happen. And then I think the second thing is, and it maybe sounds a little bit corny, but you know, it's a time in which really we're crying out for great leadership. And I really do believe that outstanding leaders can achieve outstanding and significant things in times of crisis. Even if the odds are stacked against and the structures aren't necessarily in place to help bring that sort of thing forward. But I think we have to maintain optimism, because I don't really actually see what the alternative is. I mean, the alternative is, as Robert said, we sink into a sort of form of chaos. But you know, currently the way that the international economy is set up is we have to have a certain level of cooperation. There has to be a certain level of regulation and laws in place to make things work. It may not be the brave new world that we're hoping for, but I think that the very nature of this crisis, which has proved that we are all interconnected, is going to force the world towards new forms of cooperation. I'm not sure they'll be the forms that we're hoping for, but I think that there definitely will be shifts and changes.
Rob, at the outset, you made a case for this, the narrative that this is a medical issue, that this speaks to the need for greater multilateralism, burden sharing. What are the risks, in your view, if that narrative does not win this battle for the public mind?
Well, and I think Colleen just spoke to it. I think there is. It's not just. I mean, it's not even a remote prospect. I think it is very much a live risk that countries turn inwards. And what, you know, from the perspective that my organization, the International Crisis Group, what we really focus on is what is the impact on the likelihood of conflict outbreak or perpetuation of conflicts. Our mandate is to prevent and resolve deadly conflict. And clearly, in the absence of any collective sense of responsibility, any burden sharing, any sense of trying to help other countries come out of this hole, you know, we're going to see more tensions around the world, countries that have a very difficult time dealing with the health and economic impact of COVID-19, social tensions, political tensions, scapegoating of minorities, exacerbation of conflicts because parties are going to try to take advantage of this chaotic situation. So I think we could head towards a situation of greater warfare, greater violence. It's not foretold. I mean, really, I think that for me, and I agree with Colleen, we're in the business of having to be optimistic, otherwise it's not clear what we're doing. It's not, because it's all a matter of human agency. So it's not as if there's sort of the outcome of COVID-19 is written somewhere. It's really the choices that are going to be made. And I did take, you know, the point that Michael was making before he left, which is ad hoc coalitions of like-minded countries. I don't particularly like the expression like-minded, but of countries that mobilize on a certain objective, even in the absence of guidance from a superpower. I mean, we saw some signs of it with some countries coming together to salvage what they could of the Iran nuclear deal, salvage what they could of the trade agreement, try to salvage what they could of the Paris Climate Accord. So, you know, one could hope that even if you don't have a new order that emerges, which is clear and which is, you know, that is homogeneous, that you see countries coming together because they realize that if they don't work together to try to overcome the economic, health, and public policy crises that they're facing, they will all do far worse on their own than they would collectively. So I think, you know, again, there's a whole spectrum of worlds out there that we could be heading towards, and the choices that are going to be made in the years to come will determine what it is, because we are in this period between an old order that is dying. Again, we described it earlier, and dominated by the US and others, and a new one that is yet to emerge. And I don't think we should shed too many tears for the old world. As I said, it created a lot of violence, a lot of instability, a lot of grief for many around the world. But it's this in-between period, which is a very risky and perilous one, because there's, you know, when there's no sense, no rules of the game, then anything goes.
In the time we have left, and I'll watch Elizabeth for any signals about when we're running out of time. There are 3 questions on the board, so I think we can work our way through those. From Deborah Parks, she's asking whether or not the pandemic really creates the opportunity for the discipline of thinking, clear thinking, values thinking. Her lament is that she doesn't seem to hear on the news about what's going on in other countries. Tens of thousands of migrant workers broke and stuck abroad. Colleen, I wonder if this resonates with the points that you were making earlier.
Yes, that's a really interesting observation. I do think, and maybe that's a media question back to you, Alan, for your conference that's upcoming. But you know, I would say, generally speaking, you know, at least in North America, I find we have fantastic access, for example, to written media. Access to, you know, visual media has declined so much, and it's actually quite shocking, I would say, the level of coverage that your average news consumer sees on how the pandemic is affecting the global South. You know, I think probably most of us saw sort of the dramatic images of the migrant workers leaving major urban centers in India, and the unfortunate events happened there. But you know, there is so much going on around the world, as Robert said. You know, the lockdowns that armed groups are putting communities under, who are no longer abiding by ceasefire and who are stepping into power vacuums. You know, scores of people being turned away from health services just by virtue of who they are. We have, you know, we get some things on the media around the growing levels of domestic violence. That's been very much in the media in North America. Well, that's quite multiplied in the developing world, and in places where women, for example, have no access to shelter, have no access to lawmakers. So it is quite shocking, I would say, the lack of media attention that we see. You know, I tend to, sometimes my go-to place for that type of coverage is Al Jazeera. But I think it's definitely, it's a massive question for what's happening with the media and reform in the media going forward. So in some ways, it's a very intriguing question, because the extent to which we're actually going to be able to act is very much tied to the extent that global populace is actually going to be educated in understanding what's going on in some of these countries. And that's going to be our major challenge going forward, I think, is getting the word out.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question from the board and then ask each of you just to sum up very, very briefly in a minute or so. This question is from Saeed Mirzai. How do you assess imposing unilateral sanctions which have impeded getting essentials to fight COVID-19 in some countries? Do those sanctions amount to a violation of basic human rights law? Rob?
So I'm not going to enter into the legalities of it, which I haven't looked into. I think they are so many of these unilateral sanctions are not just, they're wrong for all the reasons you could imagine in general. Forget about when you're facing a pandemic. I mean, these are cases of very often countries unilaterally deciding how other countries should lead their foreign policy. The case of Iran is a case in point where the United States is basically punishing other countries for respecting their international obligations under the deal that they signed with Iran, or that was endorsed by the Security Council. So I think there's a lot of questions just on that. But there also is the issue of, and something that we, again, at Crisis Group look at very much, broad economic sectoral sanctions, which is what these unilateral sanctions often are, almost always end up hurting the people they purport to help, and help the people they purport to hurt. The elites on top, they find ways to circumvent sanctions, to take advantage of the fact that it's harder to get access to some goods, and so they have the exclusive access. They could sell them for far greater on the black market. And so we've seen that in case after case after case that we've studied, that the elites, the people who in theory, I'm going to focus on the United States, wants to hurt, are the people who could find a way out of it, and the general population gets punished. And so today, yes, there are many cases where we're seeing these sanctions because they are broad-based, because they are not particularly targeted, and because they're unilateral. They end up hurting the very people who we should be helping. And at a time of now bringing it to the question specifically about COVID-19, we, along with many other organizations, world organizations, have said, at a minimum, make exceptions, clear exceptions, and lift those sanctions to allow countries like Iran or others to have access to the medical resources they need to take care of the pandemic. And it can be done in a way that it can't be diverted. That's what the UN has called for, that's what others have called for, and we have joined. But I think there's a broader question that needs to be looked at, which is the effectiveness of sanctions in general, when they're effective and when in fact, far from producing the political goals that they are often attached to, they end up hurting the people in whose name they often impose the sanctions.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank our panelists, Michael, Rob, Colleen, and as I said at the outset, maybe in a minute or so, if I could ask each of you just to provide some conclusions on the emerging post-pandemic world. Colleen?
Thanks. So, I mean, I guess I would say in conclusion is that I think what I'm concluding from this panel is we can definitely expect to see going forward, this uncertainty is going to continue for quite a while. I think we can expect to start to see the beginning of patterns around how multilateralism and power sharing is going to start to shift across the globe. I would not dare to say, how that's going to come out, but what I would say is important is, and this is probably especially for the CIC membership, is that now really is the time to be active and to be speaking out in favor of multilateralism, to be supporting efforts around multilateralism, joining up north and south, east and west. We're lucky in that we have the civic space in Canada to actually exercise our voice around these things. And it's a little bit counterintuitive because we've all been shut in behind our doors for so long. Many of us watching Netflix for far too long and feeling like we're living in a bubble, but it is a time to be active and to be making our voices heard. So that's really the message that I would like to leave.
Great, thank you very much. Rob?
So I would echo everything Colleen just said. In some ways, picking up on something I said earlier, I think we've been living in the post-pandemic world even before the pandemic struck. In other words, the trends that we are worried about have only been further illuminated by the pandemic, but they preceded it. And we were already in the shift in which multilateralism and collective action was being questioned around the world. And so I think this is in some ways, it should act as a wake-up call to react to things that ought to have been reacted to even earlier. Again, bring it to the organization that I'm responsible for, the International Crisis Group. What we look at is how any moment, this moment among others, can be used to mobilize people to do more to prevent and resolve deadly conflict. And if this is a moment where people could reflect, not just, we always hope that people look at it on humanitarian grounds, that people getting killed, civilians being caught up in the crossfire is something that should mobilize all of us to stop. But what the pandemic teaches us is that, again, that borders can be ignored by a pandemic. They could be ignored by migrants. They're ignored by terrorists. They're ignored by all kinds of phenomena that can overcome whatever barrier you want to put. And so the notion of a go-it-alone policy, of a whatever country first policy, that's a naive illusion, and it ends up hurting everyone, including the countries that, that adhere to it. So hopefully this is a wake-up call for many to do what they ought to have done prior to the pandemic.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks to both of you. Thank you to the Ottawa chapter of the Canadian International Council for organizing this event. Thanks for asking me to participate. And Elizabeth, I think this is the part where I throw it back to you.
Thank you, Alan, very, very much. And I'd like to thank all of you and Michael Levitt as well for a really thought-provoking conversation. This is exactly what the CIC is about. It is a way of having Canadians become part of this most important conversation. And I'm delighted at the way by which the membership of the CIC has endorsed this new medium of bringing these discussions into people's homes at a time when we're not able to do it otherwise. There's been a tremendous response by Canadians right across the country, all of our 16 branches in Canada. And we look forward to continuing the conversation, as I said earlier, with the International Development Research Center as we go forward. I'd also like to also highlight an event that is upcoming with the CIC Ottawa branch on the 29th of June. The name of the session is Defense in the Aftermath of COVID-19. And this session will be with Richard Mills Jr., who is the Chargé d'Affaires at the US Embassy. That will take place at 7 p.m. EDT. So once again, I really thank you all very much for your really valuable contributions, and Alan for moderating it so beautifully. So thank you all, and I wish you all very well.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.